Welcome to Wandering Jews at J Squared Adventures. Travel far enough and you meet yourself.
We're your hosts. I'm Scott.
I'm Sorrel.
Imagine you're standing on a Galilee hilltop. You're looking down a bird's eye view, and the Galilee is spread out like a well-set tablecloth. You can see the mosaic of villages and the crisscrossing of fields and the ribbons of roads. And Tzippori, of course, means a bird's eye view. And today we're talking about Tzippori, its place in Jewish history, what you see from the hilltop, and the historical vista across the Galilee's ages. At Tzippori itself, this ancient Jewish village, it became a thriving city in the centuries following the Roman conquest and the destruction of Jerusalem. With Jerusalem and Judea laid waste, Jewish life planted itself in the Galilee. And Tzippori became a thriving center of Jewish life, learning, and leadership under the leadership of Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the Prince. In the 3rd century CE, Judaism's age-old oral tradition was transcribed and preserved and developed in the volumes that served as the basis for the Talmud, the books known as the Mishnah. The Galilee is also full of Christian and Muslim traditions, and they resound throughout the nearby hills. From the hilltop, Tzippori became known in late antiquity as the birthplace of Miriam, Mary, the mother of Jesus. From Tzippori, the area where Jesus walked and taught among the Jewish villages and along the Galilee shore in the first half of the 1st century CE, all of those places are close at hand. From Tzippori, as the mountain road flows toward Tiberias and the Sea of Galilee, the horns of Chitin are visible, the dramatic plain and the surrounding hills where the Muslim army of Salah ad-Din, Saladin, defeated Crusader forces on the 4th of July, 1187.
You set this beautiful picture for Scott of the Galilee hilltops of Tzippori. But the story of Tzippori, actually, if we think about it, began in Jerusalem. To understand the importance of Tzippori, we have to step back to one of the most fateful events, and I'm not sure how many of us connect Tzippori with the fateful event from all of Jewish history, the destruction of Jerusalem by Rome in the summer of 70 CE. It was at the end of the first Jewish revolt against Rome. And, you know, many of you who've stood at the Western Wall, the remains of the retaining wall that was the site of the Temple of the Jews, Jerusalem lay decimated. The temple was destroyed and the population endured immense suffering at the hands of the Romans. The Jewish people were effectively exiled, a story familiar throughout the ages, from the area of Jerusalem. And basically, that was the background to the move to the Galilee, because in a time of homelessness and displacement, the Jews moved to Galilee and the Jewish population expanded as a result of the loss of Jerusalem and Judea. Tzippori became like a home to the Sanhedrin, that is the ancient supreme court and parliament, acting parliament of the Jewish people. And it was against that setting that additional waves of Jewish refugees on the heel of another Jewish revolt against Rome under the leadership of Bar Kokhba some 60 years following, that they fled the ruins of Judea for the Galilee. So the Galilee, when we look at it in isolation, what we need to remember is everything that came from it. So we're looking at this time of thriving and growth, but it came on the heels of destruction and immense suffering, where probably the concept of the day after was very distant and remote.
That image is a really important one, that connection between Jerusalem and Tzippori. The story of Tzippori and of the Sanhedrin and the figure of Judah the Prince, Yehuda Hanasi. It's really the question of what happens in the wake of the tsunami.
Yeah.
What happens in the wake of the earthquake?
How do we go on? How do we get to live another day? How do we see beyond our current situation?
And here we're talking about a century, really, from the period of the Roman occupation through the Great Revolt, the destruction of Jerusalem, the revolt in the diaspora in 113 CE, and the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135, where the Jewish people suffered. You know, it's like one slap in the face after another slap in the face after another knockdown.
The knocks just keep coming.
And when you're knocked down, how do you get up? And I think that that's really the story of Tzippori and of the Sanhedrin and of the Jewish communities of the Galilee during this period.
In this time of total desperation, there emerged a figure, right, Scott? Somebody who took the Jewish people out of that feeling of despondency and kind of this idea of deer in headlights and frozen and rooted to the spot. And that figure was Yehuda HaNasi, right?
That's right. And I think that, you know, the piece that you're saying, the sense of like being frozen, I think the Talmud preserves that sense even in the stories about the birth of Yehuda HaNasi, of Judah the Prince, that he was born, according to the legend, on the same day during the Bar Kokhba revolt, when the 10 martyrs of the Jewish people, including Rabbi Akiva, were executed by Roman occupation forces in the arena at Caesarea. And of course, people will know that every Yom Kippur, we recite the poem telling the story of these 10 martyrs and how they were tortured to death for choosing to study Torah and to stand up for the Jewish people against Rome. And so the connection there really gives Yehuda HaNasi such an urgency.
Yeah.
And he definitely was someone who was, it seems, really quite amazing. Not only was he an outstanding scholar, he was an incredible legal mind. He was a
fluent in Greek, right?
Fluent in Greek. Even in their household, the servants knew a very beautiful Hebrew. So education was really at the center of their lives. He was also an incredible diplomat. And the Talmud relates, again, we don't know exactly who this emperor was, but the Talmud shares that Yehuda HaNasi was in close contact with the emperor of Rome. It could be, based on the history, that this was Marcus Aurelius. Now, most of us know Marcus Aurelius because he was famously portrayed by Richard Harris in Ripley Scott's Gladiator, the first Gladiator, 2000. The second one is about to come out now. But Marcus Aurelius was a philosopher king in his own right. His book, The Meditations, still today, a classic about a culture of self-control, a stance of personal integrity. And it seems like there was a lot in common between Marcus Aurelius and Yehuda HaNasi. And it could be, you can imagine them, you know, sitting together, speaking, learning, talking philosophy, the issues of the day. Again, we don't know for sure, but it paints a picture of Yehuda HaNasi as a leader who really was a shoulder above all the rest, and a unique figure, obviously, in Jewish history as well.
But also, he also comes across as somebody who was very much in tune with the needs of the people. You know, he was obviously wealthy and very well educated, and you mentioned his connections and his diplomatic skills. But, you know, it was said that when there was this plague, a locust plague, and a subsequent famine that struck the lands of Israel, Yehuda HaNasi opened his granaries and stores to serve the needy public. And it's his personal humility and sense of service, of duty, of responsibility that's actually recalled in Pirkei Avot, in the Ethics of the Fathers. Whoever chooses the delights of this world will be deprived of the delights of the next world. Whoever renounces the former will receive the latter. So you see exactly how even in his position of comfort, he is really grounded and connected to the Jewish people.
For sure. I think it's very common about kind of the Talmudic ideal of leadership. And we don't have to look far all over the world today to look at people who claim leadership.
Right.
And a lot of what they're about, it seems, is self-aggrandizement, about ego, about power,
it's
about accumulating wealth.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's almost the nature of the beast. And Yehuda HaNasi, like many other figures in the Talmudic tradition, were people who had a strong understanding, as you're pointing out, of, hey, first and foremost, I'm a servant of.
Yes.
You know, and I think particularly in the historic hour where Yehuda HaNasi was living, again, this question was hanging over his head and the leadership of the Jewish people in general. We don't have Jerusalem. We don't have the temple.
Yeah.
The Jewish people are scattered. Where do we go?
What next?
Yeah, what next? And so the decision to begin to, hey, take the oral tradition that had existed since biblical times and to begin to compile it in a way that would be portable was super, super important. By this time, Jews were living across North Africa, obviously in Babylon. They had reached as far as what we call today France and Germany.
Yeah.
And to count on that in each place there would be enough competent local teachers and leaders who could keep the tradition alive and build on it. This was one of the, I think, the impulses that drove Yuda Nasi and his colleagues to begin to write down the oral tradition, to organize it into books.
What a project. What an enormous project that must have been.
Yeah, 100%. In some ways, it was like the first Jewish encyclopedia.
Yeah.
You know?
And, we take it for granted that the Mishnah, but when we think about it, and especially what you were saying, Scott, I loved how you said, the importance of it being portable. Because there was that feeling, and, we've alluded to it in a previous episode. We were talking about the National Library in Jerusalem and the idea of the people of the book. And it's a book that's been our anchor. So when we think of the Mishnah today, we don't necessarily think of it in that context. But if we set the stage with Tzippori and then Jerusalem that came before it and the temple and what it stood for, so we needed that portability. We needed, and putting it down in writing, and that project, that huge project that commenced was the beginning of the revival and the idea that the text would be what kept us anchored.
For sure. And, comparing to Rome and to Marcus Aurelius, obviously Marcus Aurelius and the emperors that came before him and came after him, they were concerned about monuments. They were concerned about architecture. They were concerned about city planning.
Yes.
That's what it meant to have an empire. The Jewish people, we didn't have that.
Impermanence.
And we didn't have permanence also. And so the idea of building an empire of pages.
I love that.
All throughout our history was really central to who we were. When we talked about the National Library, for example, we mentioned this idea of the books that fed our souls. When we talked about Ben Gurion, we talked about his own personal library and the importance of books in his life. And so these modern examples are really continuing a tradition that the Jewish people began with the Bible, with the Mishnah, with the Talmud, and all through the ages. We're not looking to build gigantic cities and huge monuments too. We're looking to build empires of pages that in the case that we need to move, we can at least feed our souls and the souls of our children.
And the image of Yehuda Nasi and, the people around him who were sitting and compiling, it almost is like, it gives you chills to think like the physical start for the setting where all this took place. And that was the beginning of the tradition that we have until today.
In the Mishnah, it's less maybe apparent. In the Gemara, the continuation, one could say, of the Mishnah that is sometimes referred to as the Talmud. Yeah. Actually, it's really the Mishnah and the Gemara together. In Gemara, you really have those debates. And can you imagine them sitting there and they're thinking about, okay, we want to put this down. What do we live in? What do we take out? Should we use this word or this word? Who should we attribute this to? How do we tell the story? And this question of how do you tell the story? Keep it alive, keep it real, keep it relevant. Make sure that people will read it when you're no longer around. Wow, those are really tough decisions that people had to make. And in some ways, again, I go back to this image of the empire of pages. It's no less challenging than having to build a city. They were building, in some ways, invisible cities.
Right. And, obviously they had to discuss the pressing question of when people will be discussing the Mishnah in a podcast in 2024. How is that going to go down? Like, obviously.
Yep, definitely. And the other piece here is, I think, this question of room, in the sense of like what's not said. Because what happens in the Mishnah a lot of times is you have a story or you have a discussion without clear conclusions. And they were wise enough to realize that if a civilization is going to live beyond us, we need to give credit to the future so that they can look back on the pages and say, you know what? they meant this. No, you know what? They meant that.
Tremendous
No, you know what?
missionaries.
We think, and that we add, and we create, and we innovate in every generation. And again, look at the wealth of the empire of pages that the Jewish people created from the time of the Bible and the Mishnah up until today. Each page is an attempt by a new generation to say, hey, we have a voice.
It's evolving.
We have a role.
It's evolving. It's open to interpretation. It's open to innovation. And maybe with Yehuda Hanassi is also like humility and foresight and vision that enabled him to be so, which is actually really remarkable when you think about it.
100%.
That maybe it's because of the impermanence. Maybe it's because we know as Jews that, there's that element of waiting for the other shoe to drop, of not allowing ourselves to feel too settled in any given reality without something happening, that we understand that nothing is set in stone.
Definitely. When you're walking through the streets at Tzippori, or I'd say the ruins of the streets at Tzippori, even though a lot of the village has obviously been rebuilt by archaeologists over the course of time, you're passing the mosaics, you're passing the ritual baths, you're walking through the marketplace, you're going up to the top of the hill, you're seeing this opulent palace, including the so-called Mona Lisa of the Galilee, this beautiful emblem in the middle of the mosaic floor of a gorgeous woman. This could be the palace where Yehuda Hanassi and his family lived. You're really walking at Tzippori in the footsteps of the giants who made our own Jewish lives possible up until today.
So the famous Mona Lisa of the Galilee that you described, Scott, is really an example, exemplifies, because when you're looking at the mosaic in Tzippori, it's not just artwork, right? It's a snapshot of life in this ancient village. It tells a story of the people who lived there, their creativity, their resilience, their ability to preserve beauty and culture even in difficult times, right? So we're not just admiring art, we're connecting to something timeless. We're taking us back to the time of, every reason in the book to just curl up in a ball and not move. And yet there was creativity, yet there was growth. The human drive to create and to communicate can be seen and appreciated through the mosaic.
That's, I think, an amazing point. I love that mosaic. Also because it's so not Jewish, meaning here it is in the middle of a thriving Jewish center where we know there were central historic figures living and working. And the mosaic obviously was a Hellenistic, it was a Greek, it was a Roman form of art. It's the face of this, again, this gorgeous woman in the middle of this beautiful mansion. And I think it hints at this sense that to be Jewish doesn't mean to turn your back on everything else, even when you're living in a century of war and revolt and oppression and exile, but that we're able to hold kind of both ends of the rope, so to speak, to still appreciate the greater world, to still be part of that greater culture, but not to give up our own, and to make sure that our voice is heard as part of that mosaic, sorry for the pun, of civilizations that make up the human family, even though it's a family sometimes that is difficult to get along with.
So in the end, visiting Tzippori, as well as observing and taking in the beauty of the surroundings, it's essentially an invitation to reflect on how we too can contribute to the narrative of our time. When you're in the middle of a situation, how do we see beyond? How do we tap into our creative selves? And it challenges us to have that forward thinking of Yehuda Hanassi, about the legacy we want to leave, about the art that can be continued, not just created, and the community that we build as a result. And we can find a deeper meaning in our own journey through life. So as you hopefully will be traveling with us with J Squared, and as you leave Tzippori, you can think, well, Tzippori was plan B, right, after Jerusalem fell. But it was so much more than that, because it became this hub of immense power and influence, even in its own right. And I think, Scott, there are some questions that we can really ask ourselves what we can take away from that.
Definitely. I mean, I think there are a lot of moments in life where obviously we're met with challenges, where we're in danger of becoming kind of fossilized, kind of petrified. And one of the things that we can learn maybe from Yehuda Hanassi and the work of the Sanhedrin in the Galilee and at Tzippori was They sense that moment of, hey, something here is going to be lost. Something here is going to become too petrified, too fossilized. It's in danger of falling apart. How do we hold it all together and make it our own and pass it down? And in all of our lives, hopefully, we can find enough strength, enough creativity to stand up in those moments and say, you know what? This is how we're going to move forward. And whether it's on the family level or the community level or the level of the Jewish people, hopefully all of us can find ways to contribute something to preventing the fossilization and the petrification and adding to the moving ahead of all of us in a powerful way.
And channel that spirit of Tzippori as we do.
And now, something for the road. A tip, a recommendation to help you make every journey your own.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Aaron. I live in Herzliya. It's a town just north of Tel Aviv on the Israeli coast. I live there with my family, my wife, my two boys, Lior and Mikey. And I'm a J-squared adventures expert educator in Israel, and I also guide Jewish journeys to Central and Southern Europe. For my One for the Road, I want to share a chapter from my Jewish journey. I like to call the world I grew up in a Confuciorthodox world. I had a classic Jewish upbringing in British suburbia. And we lit candles every Friday night. We went to synagogue every now and again, definitely on high holidays. And I was a member of a Zionist youth movement from a young age, which laid the path for me to eventually move to Israel some 20 plus years ago. But I grew up in what is known as like a Tanakh to Palmach Jewish education. That is, we knew about biblical stories, about kings, about prophets, up until the diaspora. And then we picked up the story again with Zionism and the Zionist dream, the establishment of the state of Israel, and everything in between was ignored. A vast, empty chasm of Jewish memory that was just not a part of my learning. So I kind of grew up detached from many Jewish texts, and I feel ignorant. I felt alienated. In my Sunday school classes, my reading of Hebrew was very suspect. I actually couldn't understand a word of what I was actually reading. And so when I actually moved to Israel, my Hebrew was so poor, I had to start from scratch again. I moved to the Lower Galilee, and I lived there for almost a decade. I was one of the founders of an urban kibbutz, whose mission was to build an open, collected community to provide support to disadvantaged communities by working in education, in social work in that surrounding area. And we lived a culturally Jewish existence, celebrating aspects of Jewish life. And it was at this point that I was first exposed to these texts that I've missed out on, these texts from this rabbinic period. And I started to realize how much I've missed out. Because these texts, they're known as the Talmud, have two parts, the Mishnah and the Gemara. And not far from my kibbutz lies a place called Tzippori. And Tzippori presents a connection to the past, but it also allowed us to imagine and dream for the future. It was here in Tzippori that the first written collection of this Mishnah text, these Jewish oral traditions, were edited and sealed in around 200 CE, which brings me back to my One for the Road. You see, Scott, I was scared off from Talmud due to a combination of language and upbringing. A similar scenario was recognized by the great Hebrew poet Chaim Nachman Bialik in the early 20th century. See, Bialik had made his living from teaching Hebrew in Odessa, in Ukraine. Odessa was a major center of Eastern European Jewish cultural life back then. And Bialik had a religious Orthodox Jewish education. He spoke Yiddish, the language of Eastern European Jewry. And he produced many seminal works. One of his masterpieces was the Book of Legends, or Sefer HaAgadah, a 3-volume edition of the folk tales and proverbs scattered throughout the Talmud. An English edition was actually published around 30 years ago, so it's now much more accessible. And he describes these legends, or Agadot, as a once beautiful palace, but now a ruined and abandoned field. We saw the task to rejoin the fragments of stone to make a fortress which was hold the unique worldview of Jewish people. Essentially, Bialik was inviting people to delve into rabbinic debate and find a meaningful parallel to their own modern lives. For generations, rabbinic students have studied Talmud in what is known as chavruta, in pairs, in small groups, repeatedly debating the messages, the teachings presented by great rabbis of the Roman period, the heyday of Tzippori. And now we can do that as well, especially in Tzippori, which is mentioned many times throughout the texts. One of the great rabbis of this period who lived in Tzippori was Shimon ben Lakish. See, he was an impoverished nobody. And according to legend, he actually sold himself off as a gladiator. Yep, a gladiator, a Jewish gladiator. But he eventually freed himself and he became a thief, a criminal, a bandit. Now, how does this person become such a Talmudic legend? Because one day, as it's written, Shimon ben Lakish sees a rabbi, Rabbi Yochanan, bathing inside the waters of a river. Now, Rabbi Yochanan is a distinguished rabbi, but he had long flowing locks and he had a shaved face. And Shimon ben Lakish looked at him from afar, didn't realize it was this distinguished rabbi, dived into the water, thinking he was going to save a damsel in distress. And there he is, faced by this Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan looks at him and says, "Your strength is fit for Torah." After realizing his mistake, Shimon ben Lakish replies, "Your beauty is fit for a woman." And this interaction, which is written inside the Talmud, is the beginning of a romance, a beautiful relationship between these two men. Because Rabbi Yochanan says to him, "Look, come and study Torah. And if you study Torah, you can marry my sister, who's even more beautiful than I am." Shimon ben Lakish, he became known as Reish Lakish, the gladiator criminal who developed into one of the greatest rabbis of his time. Now, Reish Lakish's story gives inspiration to anyone like me that was alienated from Jewish texts. Similar to my journey, Reish Lakish gained exposure to teachings that previously had been unattainable. The story develops into a heart-wrenching tale, which you'll discover in the Book of Legends when you read it. But Tzippori asks us the many questions about who we are and our connections to the world around us, as a Jew, as an Israeli, as a human being, but also brings us closer to our past. All around Tzippori are thousands of olive trees. Now, why do I mention olive trees? Because olive oil was found in the area from 8,000 years ago, the Neolithic period. That means that they have been producing olive oil in the area around Tzippori for eons. Now, there's many mentions of olive trees and olive oil in the Bible as a symbol of peace. It's embedded in poetic biblical literature. The Talmud also makes many references to olive and olive oil. In fact, Reish Lakish himself remarked that the land around Tzippori was a land of milk, honey, and olive oil. Now, olive oils also outlive not only their cultivators, but they thrive through many generations, from door to door, from generation to generation, continually offering produce that's not only good for our palates, but also healthy, functional, used throughout the generations. I would recommend to anybody who's visiting the ancient site of Tzippori to saunter to its namesake, the village of Tzippori, and seek out Reish Lakish, a unique local olive farm with products of the highest quality. The Neumeier family blend ancient traditions with modern sustainability, learning from the past and adapting their lessons to the present. Olive trees are a constant throughout the story of this land. The people, they come and go, but the olive trees, they remain and they witness it all. And they stand as a symbolic reminder of our aspirations to build a shared society built upon the past, that we can develop the principles of peace and harmony going into the future. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for listening. Dive deeper into the world of travel on our J Squared Adventures website. That's j2adventures.com. And stay in the loop with our latest adventures on all our social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, all under J2 Adventures. And if you enjoyed hanging out with us, don't forget to leave us a comment, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Until next time, travel safely and keep wondering. I'm Sorrel.
I'm Scott.
See you soon with the Wandering Jews.